February 19, 1945, Iwo Jima, Central Pacific. To the Japanese Imperial General Staff, the island was an impregnable fortress. Invisible trenches, interconnected tunnels, soldiers ready to die. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi believed that even with the Americans' air and naval advantage, their underground engineering would hold off the enemy for months. He didn't count on liquid fire under pressure. The thesis was simple but devastating. The samurai tradition was crushed not by better men, but by tanks adapted to spit napalm in caves. The doctrine of dying in silence collided with the American ability to improvise on an industrial scale. Hand-to-hand combat, revered by generations of Japanese warriors, was replaced by flames that ran down the cracks underground, burning not just soldiers, but ideas, and an entire era of military thought. This is the account of how the most underrated weapon in the American arsenal, the flamethrower tank, caused psychological collapse, tactical disintegration, and mass surrenders. A history where engineering destroys ideology, where fear trumps honor, and where the island that was supposed to be invincible turned into the final furnace of Japanese resistance. But before we dive behind the scenes of this transformation, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any speech. In just 36 days, 8 makeshift flamethrower tanks destroyed more than 1,000 Japanese fortifications, many of the targets located in positions that aviation, artillery, and infantry had failed to neutralize. More than 30% of enemy deaths on Iwo Jima were caused by these machines, and it was in them that the unthinkable was born, the first moral collapse of the imperial troops. Men trained from childhood to die fighting preferred to surrender to the heat of hell. If you value this type of research and believe that the story needs to be told with accuracy, facts, and respect, please leave your support. Every gesture here helps us keep the memory alive and reveal how the improbable became inevitable. Iwo Jima wasn't just an island. It was a fortress floating in the Pacific, carved with almost surgical precision by Japanese engineers who knew hand-to-hand combat had been surpassed but were unwilling to accept it. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, commander of the garrison, was not a blind traditionalist. He had served in Washington, knew the logistical power of the United States up close, and knew that he could not beat them in terms of production or mobility. So he bet on something that the Americans couldn't transport by ship: time. Instead of trying to prevent the landing, Kuribayashi converted the island into a system of prolonged death. American soldiers would be forced in, and once inside, they would be grinded inch by inch. The island, measuring just 21 kilometers, has been transformed into an underground complex with more than 1,500 fortified positions, connected by 17 miles of tunnels dug under volcanic ash. Each exit was covered by 2 or 3 secondary guns. Each ridge was a trap with crossfire. The Japanese possessed what they called invisible layers of defense, where the enemy would never see where the shot was coming from, only hear and fall. Kuribayashi banned the famous banzai cargoes, a symbol of imperial tradition. For him, wasting men was a luxury. He ordered his officers to bury the glory and prepare to kill in silence. The samurai doctrine was suppressed by a cold, almost industrial version of death. When the first Marines landed, they would encounter no visible resistance. They would walk to the edge of the hot ash, looking around, unaware that they were standing over hundreds of soldiers buried under layers of volcanic rock. This absence of initial combat, which many Americans mistook for victory, was only the first layer of a meticulously constructed plan to maximize losses and slow advances. The real battlefield was not the surface, it was the underground. While Japan dug tunnels on Iwo Jima, the United States built serial ships, automated supply trains, and production lines in 3 shifts. Each day, the Americans put into operation more tanks than the Japanese could transport in a month. And at the peak of production, in 1944, the United States produced 28 times more steel than Japan. Yes, 28 times. This difference was not just a number, it was the gulf between 2 worlds. While one sank into the rock, the other expanded his industry as a force of nature. If this statistic surprised you, comment below, "Logistics wins." Because, in fact, that's what happened. The Japanese strategy was ingenious, but it was not replicable. It was a last bet. And like every final bet, it ignored one crucial factor: the opponent was still inventing his weapons. The tunnels of Iwo Jima were dug by engineers who carried dynamite on their shoulders. without adequate ventilation and with the certainty that they would never get out of there alive. Many died during the works, but the structures withstood bombardments of 22,000 tons, one of the largest of the war. B-24 planes dropped heavy cargo for weeks without opening breaches. The tunnels were designed to withstand more than concrete. They were shaped by the island's own geology, fragments of compressed lava capable of absorbing impact and muffling detonations. American designers underestimated it. The ships ceased fire. The ground seemed quiet. But underneath, Kuribayashi waited. His men listened, smoked in silence, cleaned bayonets. When the Americans stepped on, the earth exploded. But there was one detail that Japanese engineering did not foresee. The tunnels were built with hidden exits, air passages, and escape routes, but all based on the premise of a conventional attack. None of them could withstand heat pressure or liquid fuel seeping through ducts. None of them would withstand what the Americans were still designing in the workshops in Hawaii. A tank-mounted flamethrower system with the power to penetrate these cracks and char the interior in seconds. Still, at that time, the Japanese plan was treated as perfect. Kuribayashi believed he would do what Tarawa and Peleliu could not, halt the American advance not for weeks, but for months. Deep down he knew the war was lost, but he wanted a moral victory. He wanted to show Japan and the world that a handful of disciplined men in a defensive position could cripple the greatest war machine ever built, and for a moment it seemed like it would work. When the first battalions landed, American losses were brutal. In less than 24 hours, more than 2,000 Marines were killed or wounded. No clear territorial conquest. No hills taken, just blood and craters. But the doctrine of absolute resistance, based on hiding from technology rather than confronting it, had an expiration date. She didn't know that the American response would come not from more soldiers, but from fewer men and more pressure. What Kuribayashi had built with hose and dynamite would be met with something that didn't even exist in war manuals: fire under compression. And it was just when Japanese victory seemed near that the silent tanks hit the beach. No fanfare, no flags, without any semblance of innovation. Sherman's like any other, but with a secret in his guts. Because the Americans, while Japan was digging, were welding. While the Japanese mounted sacrifices, the Americans mounted ignition pipes. And while one side was preparing to die with honor, the other was preparing the trigger that would transform that island into something not seen since Pompeii. In the next part, we'll look at how this tank was born, and how in just 20 days, the Americans improvised hell on tracks, using scrap, pressure, and engineers who had never set foot on the battlefield. Even before the first American boot touched the black sand of Iwo Jima, the U.S. High Command had already written the outcome. Based on naval intelligence reports and bombardment estimates, it was projected that the island would fall within 5 days. The Navy had dropped 22,000 shells over the slopes and caves, while 74 days of airstrikes pulverized each point marked active. On paper, the Japanese fortification should have been neutralized. On the maps, the garrison looked broken. But none of these calculations included what could not be seen from the sky: the labyrinth of tunnels, the fanatical disposition of the defenders, and above all, the silent doctrine of Kuribayashi. American faith in the accuracy of bombing demonstrated a blind confidence in technological capability, but it forgot that even technology does not overcome what it does not detect. The bombardment was visual, but the enemy was invisible. Admiral Turner, who was responsible for the landing, even stated that there was no significant Japanese structure left in the attack area. This type of underestimation, repeated in other campaigns, would cost thousands of lives in the first hours. As the Marines stepped out of the boats and advanced along the beach, the silence seemed like a good omen. No shots, no resistance. It was a trap. When the first platoon reached the second line of sand, machine guns emerged from hidden positions, and mines began to explode underfoot. It was as if the island was awakening, and what was awakening was an underground killing machine. More than 2,400 U.S. casualties were recorded on the first day alone, the highest number in a single landing so far. The initial confidence evaporated. The 5-day plan turned into a logistical nightmare. The tunnels were intact, the soldiers unharmed. The shells had failed to break what was not visible. The illusion of American superiority collapsed in the face of an enemy that did not fight on the surface. A miscalculation that would resonate in internal speeches and reports with an uncomfortable coldness. We underestimated the nature of the island. But this mistake, while devastating, was not terminal. On the contrary, he forced the United States to recognize that it was not facing a common battle. And as a response, the doctrine has changed. Victory would not come by insistence, but by invention. It was necessary to create a weapon that would penetrate the darkness, that would transform the interior of the tunnels into a hostile space. And this psychological trigger, the inability to move forward, was the fuse that unleashed the most unlikely project in the American arsenal. A tank that did not fire projectiles, but fire. A machine that didn't conquer positions, incinerated them. In the next part, we will reveal where and how this tank was born, and because it was built not in factories but in makeshift garages, by men who knew that if they failed, the price would be paid in thousands more lives on the volcanic sand. The most lethal of Iwo Jima's weapons was not born in Detroit nor in Springfield, nor even in the industrial centers that produced bombers as if they were automobiles. She was born in a makeshift barracks in Hawaii, commanded by a colonel who ignored protocols and bet everything on an idea out of the manual. His name was George Unmacht. Their mission? To turn a conventional tank into a liquid-fire weapon, a self-propelled flamethrower capable of hunting Japanese inside tunnels. The idea came months before the landing on Iwo Jima, when reports from the previous campaigns revealed that neither heavy artillery nor prolonged bombardment could dislodge soldiers entrenched in caves. The infantry bled every meter. The problem was not one of bravery. It was access. The Japanese positions simply could not be hit. Unmacht understood that the battlefield had changed, and with limited support and no time for formal requests, he decided to improvise. He called for a mixed team of Marines, civil engineers, metalworkers, and even shipyard workers. At the Schofield Barracks Supply Center, the CBH-1 began to take shape, an improvised acronym for an improvised model, a Sherman M4A3 adapted to fire pressurized fire jets. The process was as rudimentary as it was daring. The main gun was removed and replaced with a system of pipes and valves connected to a flammable fuel reservoir consisting of napalm, gasoline, and diesel. A nitrogen-fueled compressor would propel the liquid at high pressure, while an electric ignition system created the firing. The theoretical scope? More than 150 yards. The team had to reinvent just about everything, from isolating the fuel lines inside the hull to mounting a dummy turret to hide the gun. And all this was done in less than 30 days, with materials reused from damaged tanks, civil pipes, and spare parts. No assembly line, no corporate oversight, just sweat, rust, and urgency. American military doctrine did not provide for flamethrower tanks at that time. The weapon was considered unstable, dangerous to the crew, and until then ineffective in open terrain. But the land on Iwo Jima was not open. It was a labyrinth, and that was exactly the differential. The CBH-1 did not need to aim. It was enough to point to the darkness. The fire would do the rest. The intelligence behind this creation wasn't just technical, it was strategic. Unmacht and his men did not seek to destroy buildings. They wanted to break the will of the enemy. Napalm didn't just kill. He invaded the tunnels, consumed oxygen, and turned caves into ovens. Engineers designed the system to perform under extreme conditions. Vibration, external heat, mud, field recalibration. It was a rough but functional machine. In tests in the mountains of Hawaii, the CBH-1 showed that it could sustain continuous fire for 80 seconds, with immediate ignition and the ability to reignite. The operators were trained in a hurry, with basic instructions. Protect the crew, advance under cover, do not stop to aim. Each tank would operate with a support team, mechanics, escort infantry, resupply trucks. It was combined war, long before that concept became official doctrine. The gun was ready, but there was a problem. The command still resisted the idea. Many officers saw flamethrower tanks as dirty, dishonorable weapons. Others feared that its effectiveness would be limited, but in the end, it was mathematics that won. Internal projections indicated that the capture of Iwo Jima could cost as many as 40,000 American casualties. If the CBH-1 tanks could reduce this number by just 20%, they would have already served their purpose. 8 units were released. Only 8. But these 8 would become the most feared vehicles of the war in the Pacific. Japan did not know they existed. No intelligence predicted flaming tanks operating systematically. No doctrine of underground resistance included this variable. The CBH-1 was therefore more than a weapon. It was a breach of logic, a denial of traditional confrontation. Instead of conquering tunnels, the Americans began to evaporate them. The enemy, trained to die with dignity, has found a new way to die, without warning, without combat, without chance. And it was this asymmetry between sacrifice and efficiency that made the Japanese generals clash. Because you no longer die fighting. He was burned to death in the dark without having seen the face of his opponent. In the next few minutes, the battlefield of Iwo Jima will see this weapon in action for the first time. And with a single shot, the Kuribayashi tunnels will prove that even the best of planes can't withstand 300 psi of pressure and 100 cubic meters of liquid fire. The CBH-1 was, in essence, a solution forged between improvisation and despair, a weapon that should never exist, and that only emerged because the enemy proved invulnerable to conventional tools. In its 31 tons, there was more than steel. There were 1,100 handmade electrical connections, 7 valves tuned to withstand 300 psi pressure, and an ignition system based on sparks generated by automotive coils from disassembled trucks. The fuel, a thick mixture of napalm with aviation gasoline and marine diesel, was stored in internal tanks reinforced with manual welds and protected by insulating plates. To prevent internal explosions, the system used compressed nitrogen, ensuring constant pressure without oxidation. The effective range of the fire was 150 yards, more than double the range of the conventional handheld flamethrowers used by the Marines. But the real difference was in the duration. Up to 80 seconds of continuous fire, enough time to cross the tunnel openings, descend through the passages, and turn a defensive position into an unbearable heat chamber. Every inch of the machine is designed to perform in extreme conditions: volcanic sand, tropical heat, constant shaking. There was no luxury, just function. What the Japanese called a tank with a firearm was in practice a mobile furnace guided by instinct. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The flamethrower already existed, but no one had considered combining it with an armored chassis and tactical mobility. If you're enjoying unraveling these realities hidden beneath the dust of war, show your support, like this content, and subscribe. This allows us to continue revealing how improvisation often trumps planning. The CBH-1 wasn't pretty. The turret seemed out of place, the lines were rough, and the adjustments were made under pressure. But this rudimentary appearance concealed a functional engineering of the first order. A secondary system allowed the turret to rotate with an accuracy of up to 3 degrees, making it easier to fire at complex angles. Fuel was loaded in insulated compartments, with armored lines to prevent premature ignition. The tests in Hawaii demonstrated its ability to operate under fire, withstanding direct hits from small arms and explosive fragments. The operators, trained within a few weeks, were usually artillery mechanics or soldiers with basic technical knowledge. They were not elite fighters, but practical men trained to keep the machine alive even under attack. The doctrine was clear. The CBH-1 never operated alone. Each unit was accompanied by an infantry platoon, 2 escort vehicles, and a resupply truck. In the field, the operation was synchronized. Infantry located the opening, coordinated suppressive fire, and the CBH-1 advanced, positioned, and fired. The impact was absolute, not only physical, but psychological. The sounds of the gunfire, a dry explosion followed by a continuous roar, went through trenches. The black smoke mixed with the smell of burning metal. The fire seeped in. The Japanese doctrine, based on resistance and honor, did not provide for this. There was no answer to the fire coming from the ground. The Japanese prepared to die fighting, but the CBH-1 offered no combat. It offered extinction. And this detail, the absence of confrontation, was what most shook the accounts of survivors. The enemy did not see the sniper, did not hear commands, had no chance to retreat. I just felt the temperature rise, the oxygen disappear, and the air become a burning liquid. The tunnels, once a refuge, have become traps. In many positions, the bodies could not even be recovered, simply charred, transformed into silence. And all this created in less than 20 days. No factory, no formal budget, only with anonymous workers, basic tools, and the sense of urgency that only war provides. Machinists, locksmiths, field electricians, men who never stepped on the front line but who decided her fate. Japan was not only facing tanks, it faced the direct result of an economy that produced more steel in a week than Japan did in 3 months. And more importantly, a mentality that rewarded adaptation, not tradition. When the CBH-1s boarded the ships heading to Iwo Jima, no one imagined that they would be protagonists. The operation was experimental. His success was not guaranteed. But the mere presence of these tanks would alter the logic of the battlefield. And from the next part, we will witness how this vehicle, born of improvisation, rewrote the oldest rule of war. He who controls the terrain controls the victory. Because on Iwo Jima the land was no longer soil, it was fire, and he had wheels. February 19, 1945. The black sand of Iwo Jima received the first steps of 30,000 American Marines. The deafening sound of naval artillery had died down a few hours ago, and the silence that remained was not peace. It was a trap. The landing began under a false sense of conquest. The enemy seemed absent, but it only took 30 minutes for the true nature of the island to reveal itself. Concealed machine guns opened fire from the slopes of Mount Suribachi, mines planted under seafoam exploded under tanks, and precision shots, fired from invisible crevasses, struck officers with surgical precision. In less than 6 hours, more than 2,000 Americans were dead or wounded. Each advance of 1 meter cost a life. Marines dug holes in the hot sand just to protect themselves from gunfire that didn't know where it was coming from. The Kuribayashi tunnels did their job. The Japanese were everywhere and nowhere. To the rear of the beach, discreetly unloaded from the LSTs, were the CBH-1s. Mixed with conventional Shermans, their fake turrets hid what no one yet knew was about to begin. On the first day, they didn't take action. They were positioned, fueled, tested in silence. Its hastily trained operators were waiting for the order, and the order would come, not out of protocol, but out of desperation. On the second day of fighting, after dozens of failed attempts to seize a bunker located on an elevation known as Hill 382, a company commander requested reinforcement. It was no longer possible to continue attacking with portable flamethrowers. Men died before they came within 20 meters of the entrance. The infantry retreated. Morale was beginning to crack. That's when someone said, "Bring the fire tank." The CBH-1 surged through the wreckage of wrecked vehicles, flanked by Marines ducked under continuous fire. When he came within 60 meters of the target, he rotated the turret, positioned the barrel short, and activated the ignition. The first shot released a tongue of liquid fire nearly 50 meters long, which snaked through the air with a deep, explosive roar. The napalm penetrated the entrance to the cave, ran down the rocks, and spread in all directions. What was once an impenetrable, silent fortress was now a red-hot oven. The machine guns ceased immediately. The bunker was reduced to silence, not by external destruction, but by internal saturation. No Japanese came out. None fired again. The report of the Marines who witnessed the shooting is unanimous. The sound, the heat, the psychological effect, everything at that moment indicated that something had changed. The war, until then marked by the friction between flesh and steel, now gained a thermal dimension. Fire ceased to be tactical and became doctrinaire. The secret weapon, born in a Hawaii barracks, made its debut in front of a garrison that had no antidote. The next bunker fell in less than 10 minutes, the third in 6. The CBH-1s didn't require perfect aim, they only required line of sight. The impact on the Japanese was immediate. Intercepted messages over the next few days revealed that the commanders did not know how to react. Some even ordered the soldiers to leave the caves at the signal of fire in a desperate attempt to avoid death by combustion, but this order was never fulfilled. The tunnels, built as an absolute shelter, now became fatal prisons. The island was beginning to change color. The black areas of sand mingled with dark patches of burnt napalm, and the smell of fuel mixed with burnt flesh spread through the wind. Witnesses described the effect as the birth of a new type of fear. It was no longer about avoiding bullets, it was about not being swallowed by fire, and this fear, fueled by each shot of the CBH-1, turned resistance into hesitation. The American infantry, once held back by the terror of the tunnels, now advanced under the protection of mechanical fire. War was no longer symmetrical. The Japanese, until then confident in the superiority of their defensive doctrine, now faced an enemy who did not try to overcome their defenses, only liquefy them. And all this with 8 operating units. The most impressive thing was this: only 8 flamethrower tanks were active on Iwo Jima, but they would break the backbone of Japanese resistance. In the next few hours, the battlefield would cease to be a maze of tunnels and become a map of targets for incineration. And Japan, which had bet everything on the solidity of the subsoil, would discover that even rocks burn. In the next chapter, we'll look at how tanks began to be used as instruments of strategic terror, and how the mere sound of their engines became enough to make soldiers abandon positions without a fight. The first shot of the CBH-1 didn't just destroy an enemy position, it changed the sound of war. Until then, the battlefield on Iwo Jima was punctuated by dry explosions, precision gunfire, and the tense silence between ambushes. But as the fire tank spat out its charge of pressurized napalm for 80 seconds, a new noise imposed itself, a continuous, dense roar that seemed to consume the air itself. The casemate, built to withstand naval artillery and 1,000-pound bombs, was not prepared for the heat. The liquid fuel seeped through the cracks, spread to the interior walls, trickled down access tunnels, and saturated the room with heat that no air filter could contain. Within seconds, oxygen was drained, temperatures exceeded 700 degrees Celsius, and the screams of those inside abruptly ceased. For the Marines positioned ahead, it was like watching an invisible collapse. No explosion. No enemy leaving armed, just the smell, a thick odor which spread with the wind throughout the front line. It was the smell of charred human flesh, a chemical warning that the war had changed. When the fire subsided, 3 Japanese soldiers rushed out of the structure, engulfed in flames. They tried to flee in a zigzag but were shot down before completing 20 meters. The image was recorded by war correspondents and later shown to intelligence officers. Imperial soldiers fleeing combat, running from the fire like panicked civilians. It was an unprecedented behavior. The Japanese army's doctrine was clear: to die, not surrender. Do not abandon the position. But CBH-1 introduced a variable that was not foreseen in the Bushido Code: thermal panic. The fire wasn't just pain, it was disorientation. When it penetrated the tunnels, it transformed the air into combustible vapor. Soldiers suffocated even before they were hit by the flames. The clothes caught fire in contact with the saturated air, and the screams, muffled by the galleries, echoed like warnings of imminent death. American intelligence quickly realized that the impact of the weapon was not just physical, it was moral. The nearby trenches began to empty. Instead of holding their ground, as the Japanese manual ordered, soldiers began to retreat into deeper caves, abandoning key points. Intercepted radio reports revealed contradictory orders. Officers demanded resistance to the last man, but sergeants were already asking for permission to pick up the wounded or seal entire tunnels. The gun became, with each shot, more than a tool of attack. It became a vector of psychological collapse, and this collapse spread like fire on dry paper. Imperial units that had not yet engaged the tanks began to move their positions preemptively, altering plans, redirecting resources, digging alternative passages. It was the anticipation of terror. An American officer reported that as they approached a Japanese line, they found abandoned positions with guns still loaded. No body, no explosion, just empty trenches and runaway footmarks. For the first time in the entire Pacific theater, Imperial soldiers preferred to retreat rather than die in combat, and all caused by a weapon that, weeks before, was considered experimental. The domino effect was silent but devastating. Throughout the second week of combat, the CBH-1s began to be called upon not only to destroy fortifications, but to break moral resistances. One shot near a tunnel entrance was enough to disrupt coordinated attacks. In one of the most symbolic actions, a platoon commander reported that the mere sound of the approaching tank, the specific noise of the flamethrower's ignition being tested, caused the mass escape from a position that had required 3 days of direct combat. There was no shooting, just the sound. War, which until then followed the standards of strength and honor, now included the fear factor. A new fear. A fear that Japanese culture was not prepared to face because it was not based on glorious death, but on unbearable death. Kuribayashi, who had staked everything on underground resistance, began to realize that time was working against him. His strategy, brilliant in physical containment, was being eroded by thermal terror. The tunnels, his trump card, were becoming traps. Every meter of American advance was now protected by a weapon that did not need to hit directly. It was enough to hit the surrounding air, and this new domain, the dominance of the climate within the war, belonged only to the United States, because it was no longer about brute force. It was about environmental control. The Americans had learned to shape the battlefield to their will, and the Japanese, with all their discipline and courage, were being overcome by an equation they did not know how to solve: pressure plus temperature, multiplied by precision. In the next few actions, we will see how the coordinated use of flamethrower tanks and infantry troops created a new combined tactic, and how the Americans came to capture Japanese soldiers not out of compassion, but because the only alternative to fire was to raise their hands, a reality that no imperial general had even considered. No doctrine foresaw what happened on Iwo Jima. There were no manuals describing how to operate flamethrower tanks on volcanic soil under a rain of shells, with tunnels collapsing a few meters from the tracks. But the CBH-1 crews, made up of mechanics, electricians, and private men, did not wait for instructions. They created. On the third day of combat, the maneuver that would redefine the use of the weapon was born: corkscrew and burn. The tactic was simple but effective. First, the infantry identified a possible tunnel opening or defensive position. Then the tank would approach in a spiral, always protecting its flanks. When it reached the ideal distance, it fired at an angle, allowing the napalm to enter the crevices, bounce off the walls, and saturate the interior spaces. The combination of pressure, fire, and oxygen created a thermal implosion inside the caves. It was a form of struggle that did not seek total destruction, but the complete annulment of resistance. Other patterns emerged spontaneously: the use of ruins as a support point for downhill shooting, the adaptation of the terrain itself as a ramp to reach higher tunnel mouths, and even indirect fire, throwing fire at the entrance to the tunnel so that it flowed by gravity to the lower compartments. Each tank was a laboratory, each operator a field engineer. The American response went beyond fire. It manifested itself in the structure that began to accompany each vehicle. A CBH-1 no longer operated on its own. It was preceded by infantry scouts, followed by covering platoons, surrounded by combat engineers, and supplied by mobile convoys with fuel and nitrogen. It was, in practice, a tactical microforce, a battalion operating around a single tank. The operation was coordinated via radio, with an exclusive frequency, and each unit had a team of mechanics capable of carrying out repairs in less than 20 minutes, even under fire. It was combined warfare before the concept formally existed. A clear example of this logic emerged in the seizure of Area 362, a fortified point that had withstood bombardment for 7 days. A CBH-1, operating in coordination with 3 infantry platoons and an armored excavator, fought its way behind the hill, bypassed the enemy position, and fired through the upper openings. The bunker collapsed within minutes. There was no frontal attack. There was geometry, improvisation, and adaptation. But this kind of adaptation required more than courage. It required refueling. And here, American logistics shone with maximum intensity. For every 2 shots, one tank consumed more than 200 gallons of special fuel. This required mobile supply lines, portable depots, protected supply routes, all operating in real time, over unstable terrain, and in the midst of fire. In many cases, specialized trucks transported fuel at night, under cover of darkness to avoid mortar attacks. And even so, no CBH-1 stopped operating due to lack of fuel. None. The logistical machinery was as precise as it was deadly. And this for the enemy was incomprehensible. A captured report from a Japanese officer read, "They never stop. They never come back. How is it possible that they bring fire every day, every moment?" This Japanese astonishment reflected a truth that the Germans also ignored. The American war machine was not only made of steel, it was made of flow. In 1944, the United States produced 87,000 tanks a year. Germany, in the same period, only 18,000. And this disproportion was not just numerical, it was conceptual. While the Reich tried to perfect each model, the Americans produced them in series, with variants adapted to the needs of the field. The CBH-1 was an example of this. It wasn't the best tank, he was not the most protected, but it was what was there, working, improvised, deadly, and that was enough. If this statistic impressed you, 87,000 against 18,000, write in the comments, absolute power, because that's what defines the difference between inventing and implementing at scale. This flexibility did not come from above. It was born in the countryside. When a tank had a failure in the ignition system, the operator installed a coil extracted from a jeep. When the pressure dropped due to leakage, the mechanics improvised sealants with naval grease. Nothing stopped the operation. Each tank that broke was reassembled in less than 48 hours. And every time I returned to the field, I came back better, The war was being won on the sand, but it was also won in the calloused hands of men who knew the weight of each bolt. The Japanese, bound by a rigid doctrine, watched the war turn before them. With each new shot a tactic, with each new crater an idea. The Americans didn't just have firepower, they had the ability to learn, in real time, under real fire. In the next episode of this battle, we will see the ultimate impact of these combined operations, when a group of Imperial soldiers, surrounded by fiery tanks and with no chance of escape, did the unthinkable. For the first time, dozens of them laid down their weapons, came out of the caves, and raised their hands. The surrender was not a gesture of weakness. It was a muffled cry from someone who understood that, in the face of fire, the code of honor had turned grey. When the first reports of the presence of the flamethrower tanks reached the Japanese command post on Iwo Jima, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi understood that he was not just facing new weaponry, he was facing a new kind of war. Its tunnels, built with discipline and precision, had been designed to withstand explosives, resist artillery, and outwit aviation. But there was no calculation that could withstand 80 seconds of pressurized fire with liquid napalm, running down the galleries like lava, turning breathable air into lethal gas. Kuribayashi reacted like a commander who refuses to surrender. He issued desperate orders. Prioritize attacking flame tanks. Organize suicide units with mines strapped to their bodies to detonate under the tracks. Blind the crews with concentrated shots in the crevices of the turret. Anything to keep the fire from coming back, but nothing worked. The tanks were protected by entire platoons, its operators, armored and alert, and most of all, invisible until the last second, because they were identical to ordinary Shermans. The enemy had hidden the most feared weapon within what seemed ordinary, and this ambiguity, this disguise, fueled terror. Each tank could be the tank. Each advance could mean the end of a position. And how to attack something that you don't know is there. Sacrificial strategies, glorified since childhood by generations of Japanese soldiers, began to crumble in the face of the unpredictability of fire. Human explosives, often triggered by silk ropes or rudimentary mechanisms, failed before they even reached their target. The American infantry, in coordinated formation, shot down the ground kamikazes before they approached. In rare cases, even when a soldier managed to launch himself under the tank, the armor resisted. The explosion injured himself, but not the vehicle. Kuribayashi, a man of refined tactics, began to appeal to messages of honor. Letters were sent to the cornered units, reminding them of the glory of dying in combat. Orders to resist to the death were urgently rewritten, as if words could extinguish the sound of the flames. But what burned were not only soldiers. It was the doctrine. The idea that discipline and sacrifice would win over technology, evaporated with each tunnel, turned into a furnace. In many sectors of the island, officers began to lose control of their units. Communication was interrupted not by technical failures, but by the collapse of will. Entire deployments were abandoned before the arrival of the CBH-1. In an intercept made by American intelligence, a Japanese soldier begged for extra ammunition, not to fight, but to kill himself before the tank arrived. Suicide, which was once an act of glory, became a desperate escape from a crueler fate. The fear did not come from death, but from the form of death. No Japanese military code provided for combustion, no ritual accepted to be reduced to ashes, and this incompatibility between tradition and reality dissolved the spirit of struggle. The German underestimation of American capability never imagined this kind of sophistication. While the doctrine of the Reich was based on strategic rigidity, the Americans demonstrated at Iwo Jima that war was also a field of moral adaptation, and when the enemy's morale breaks, combat turns into a harvest. By the end of the third week, the first groups of Japanese soldiers began to appear, surrendering in silence, not out of cowardice, but out of desperation. They came out of the caves with their hands raised, uninjured, but with empty eyes. They had survived hell. They had heard the cries of those who burned. They had felt the heat coming through the walls. For these men, surrender was a last gesture of humanity, because to resist meant to disappear. Subsequent interrogations would confirm that many did not even know what the CBH-1 was. They called him a ghost tank or a steel dragon, mythological creatures, born of American engineering, who had broken not only bunkers, but millennial codes. This moral collapse was the true unstated purpose of the weapon. It did not exist to destroy structures. It existed to make any resistance useless, to break the link between the body and the idea. American fire burned more than soldiers. It burned symbols. And when the symbol of honor is destroyed by a jet of napalm, only ideological ash remains. From the next part on, we will understand how this same logic, applied on other islands and repeated on an industrial scale, would transform the flamethrower tanks of Iwo Jima into silent precursors to an even more devastating weapon, and why the Japanese, by surrendering to fire, unknowingly opened the way to atomic silence. Mount Suribachi, at 169 meters high, was not only the highest point on Iwo Jima, it was the symbolic heart of the Japanese defense. Its volcanic structure, dug with millimeter precision, housed one of the most complex tunnel systems in the Pacific Theater. Interconnected by galleries that crossed the mountain at irregular angles, the Suribachi was a vertical fortress. From its slopes, heavy machine guns and anti-tank guns dominated the American landing on the southern beaches, especially in the red zone. Each cave, each hole, each fissure had a lethal function. So taking it wasn't just a tactical maneuver, it was a moral statement. And what the Japanese expected to be a weeks-long fight was dismantled in less than 5 days, not because of numerical superiority, but by the invisible heat of the pressurized fire. The CBH-1s did not attack the ridge directly. They climbed up the flanks, using the cover of the ridge to approach side caves. While the Marines occupied positions on the slopes, the tanks poured fire in a semicircle, saturating the ventilation galleries and secondary exits. In one specific operation, recorded by reconnaissance drones of the time, a single tank was responsible for neutralizing 5 artillery positions in less than 12 minutes. The flames ran through the curves of the terrain as if they had their own gravity. The upper entrances smoked even before physical contact, indicating that the fire, when it encountered oxygen, made reverse pressure, invaded the tunnel, and consumed it from the inside out. And when the flames ceased, the echoes of screams disappeared with them. On the Japanese side, panic was escalating. Communications between the units inside Suribachi began to fail, not because of American interference, but because the underground cables melted in the heat. Orders did not arrive. Reinforcements did not leave. The mountain became an isolated oven. Soldiers tried to escape from the sides, but found entrenched Marines ready to shoot them down. At various times, the positions were found completely silent. Not a shot, not a sound. Just the thick smell of burnt napalm. The Suribachi, which was supposed to be the final bulwark of the resistance, became a crater of silence. The final ascent to the summit took place on February 23, 1945. While tanks were still operating on the south and west slopes, a group of Marines climbed the less protected slope. They met no resistance, only charred corridors, dropped weapons, and still hot rock walls. When the flag was raised high on the mountain, the famous photograph captured the moment when American symbolic superiority was fixed at the heart of Japanese doctrine. But what the image does not show, and few understood at the time, is that that flag was only possible because in the previous hours, the fire tanks had broken the bowels of the mountain. They didn't just pave the way, they ripped the soul out of Suribachi. Post-battle reports confirmed that more than 70% of the mount's defensive positions were destroyed by thermal fire. Only 12 Japanese soldiers were captured alive in the takeover operation. The others had died of asphyxiation, combustion, or suicide, and yet the tunnels remained hot for days. An American engineer who inspected the interior of a cave reported that the rock was still hissing, as if the war continued underground. This phrase, noted in his diary, reveals the dimension of the impact. Fire, unlike bullets, remains. And there, in the bowels of the ultimate symbol of Japanese resistance, he left scars deeper than craters. The effect of the fall of the Suribachi was immediate and devastating to Japanese morale. Radio transmissions ceased. Orders began to be transmitted verbally by messengers who died before arriving. A Japanese officer, in a letter intercepted 3 days later, wrote, "The mountain that watched over the men now bleeds from the mouth." The personification of the mountain, seen as a guardian, as a mother of stone, shows that its destruction was not only geographical, it was spiritual. The myth of Japanese invulnerability had been burned with industrial precision, and the responsible, once again, was not the soldier with the bayonet. It was the valve operator, the field mechanic, the retrofitted tank in a barracks in Hawaii. This symbolic turn was so strong that it began to be used as internal propaganda by the United States. The image of the flag in Suribachi, replicated in newspapers, radios, and posters, became an icon of moral victory. But what few knew is that behind that flag, the smell of technical victory still flowed, because the mountain has not been conquered, it was merged. And this fusion, brought about by pressure, engineering, and fire, would mark the beginning of a new era of combat. In the next few scenes, we'll see how flamethrower tanks, now proven effective, became a tactical priority, and how their production was accelerated for use in Okinawa, the Philippines, and potentially Japanese territory itself. Because what burned on Iwo Jima was not just a mountain, it was the whole myth of unbreakable resistance. On the 16th day of the battle for Iwo Jima, the war seemed to have reached a new state of exhaustion. Lines stabilized, frontal attacks decreased, and Japanese resistance focused on mountainous enclaves inaccessible by conventional tanks. One of these points was known to the Marines as Cliff 93, a 30-meter-high elevation of volcanic rock, leaning against vertical walls, protected by 3 caves positioned in staggered unevenness. For 4 days, airstrikes, artillery, and infantry assaults had failed. The caves seemed unreachable, both because of the verticality of the terrain and the position of the Japanese snipers, who fired at perfect downward angles, making any advance suicidal. It was against this backdrop that one of the most unlikely and definitive maneuvers of the war in the Pacific emerged. The crew of the CBH-1 tank assigned to Company E realized that, despite the impossibility of climbing up to the caves, there was a point where the sloping terrain formed an inverted crater. There, among the rubble of hardened lava and craters caused by naval artillery, the tank could be tilted manually, using debris and sandbags as a support base. It was an absurd idea. Our tank, weighing more than 30 tons, with its center of gravity altered, becoming unstable, and worse, exposed. But the reasoning was clear. If direct fire was not feasible, the only way was to turn the flamethrower into a curved trajectory weapon. By tilting the cannon's mouth, the crew intended to launch the napalm in arcs, allowing the fuel to fly through the cliff through the air and reach the upper entrances to the caves. A kind of ballistic fire, never tested in combat, improvised in the heat of necessity. It took 2 hours to prepare the positioning. Soldiers manually dug up the slope, placed rocks to support the rear tracks, and tied the tank with steel cables attached to stakes driven into the lava to prevent it from sliding. The scene was so improbable that it was even filmed by a Navy cameraman. When the tank was finally stabilized, the turret slowly rotated. The operator, aware of the risk of premature combustion, activated the ignition system at interval. The first burst was short, almost experimental. The napalm rose in an arc, lost momentum midway through the path, and fell before reaching the target. The second attempt was longer, 60 seconds of continuous fire at maximum pressure. The fuel drew a perfect semicircle in the air and entered directly into the upper cave. The response was immediate. An internal explosion, followed by partial collapse of the entrance, signaled that something inside had ignited beyond what was anticipated. Within seconds, black smoke began to come out of side cracks. The Japanese, who had been hiding there for nearly a week, had nowhere to run. The psychological impact was immediate. The remaining caves, until then occupied by snipers, were abandoned in less than 20 minutes. Marines observed figures running down the flanks of the cliff, some on fire, others unarmed. They tried to escape through improvised paths, but found American positions in the vicinity. The natural fortress, built on the belief that altitude was invincible, had been overcome by a curved shot. A shot that, in theory, did not exist. The Japanese doctrine, based on verticality as a defensive advantage, collapsed in the face of a new logic: creativity under fire. And this creativity didn't come from generals. It came from the operators, the sergeants, the mechanics, who turned each tank into a tactical variable. The American command quickly recognized the feat. The impossible shot episode was included in internal tactical bulletins, became a reference for new approaches, and inspired modifications to the flamethrower's design, including improvements to the aiming system for tilt shots. In the following weeks, other operators began to replicate similar maneuvers, using ruins as ramps, craters as platforms, and even destroyed tanks as structural support. The traditional concept of mechanized combat, based on straight lines and frontal attacks, was beginning to be reformulated in the field. It was no longer just about moving machines. It was a matter of integrating them into the relief, of adapting their limits to the possibilities of the terrain. And that the Germans never understood. While the Reich spent resources refining prototypes of heavy tanks like the Tiger II, the production of which required months, precision parts, and constant maintenance, the Americans perfected the use of what they already had. The CBH-1 was an adaptation, not an invention, an example of the American industrial doctrine: fast, functional, replicable. For every German Tiger II, the United States placed 20 modified Shermans in the field, many of them with flamethrowers. If this disproportion is still astonishing, it is enough to remember that, in the first quarter of 1945, American tank production exceeded German by more than 700%. Write in the comments, "Logistics wins," because on Iwo Jima, she was the one who wrote the victory manual. With the victory at Cliff 93, flamethrower tanks ceased to be support weapons and became central pieces in the offensive maneuver. The Army and Marines identified their effectiveness not only in destroying positions, but in altering the geometry of the battlefield. War ceased to be linear and became three-dimensional. The next part of this account will take us to one of the most profound consequences of this change: how fire tanks, now legitimized by the success at Suribachi and the Cliffs, came to be integrated into the plans for Okinawa, and how this new doctrine would begin to influence even the way strategists thought about ending the war in the Pacific. As the American columns advanced toward the northern plateau of Iwo Jima, an unexpected phenomenon began to repeat itself. Meticulously constructed bunkers, reinforced with steel beams and positioned months in advance, were being found empty. In many cases, they still had ammunition, water, maps, and equipment organized as if their occupants had left in a hurry. There were no signs of combat, no shots, no bodies, just abandonment. To the field commanders, at first, it sounded like a trap. Patrols were sent out cautiously, but the same scene was repeated: abandoned pillboxes, silent caves, deserted tunnels. The unthinkable was happening. The Japanese soldiers were giving up the fight before the first shot was even fired. Not because of hunger, not because of lack of ammunition, but by the muffled sound of treadmills, by the distant smell of diesel mixed with napalm, by the silhouette on the horizon of a CBH-1. The advance on the northern region of the island, which began in the third week of the campaign, met with a defense that no longer reacted as before. Before, every meter was contested with gunfire, mines, and grenades. Now the Marines reported positions being surrendered without a fight. A commander of the 3rd Marine Division wrote, "It was as if the fire had passed before us. All it took was for the tanks to appear in the field of vision, and the white flags appeared." The symbol of suicidal honor began to be inverted. Pride, which had previously been measured by the willingness to die, now gave way to silent survival. There was no doctrine that explained how to confront a gun that burned without warning, and worse, a weapon that didn't need to fire to win. In one of the most striking episodes of the advance to the north, a Japanese position with a capacity of 200 soldiers was found completely unoccupied. The Americans believed they were facing a new kind of fortification, a labyrinth that would take hours to dismantle. But it was enough for a flamethrower tank to position itself at the main entrance that in less than 10 minutes, 47 soldiers voluntarily surrendered. Among them, 2 officers. Interrogated in the camp, they confessed they had been ordered to resist until death. But they could no longer convince men to burn to death. One of them said, "I'd rather be a prisoner of the living than a specter of flames." It was the final break in the doctrine. The presence of the tank had suppressed the will. From a tactical point of view, this transformation had decisive consequences. Areas that would have required days of siege were conquered within hours. Defensive lines collapsed at the first sign of approach. American logistical planning, based on weeks of continuous combat, began to be revised in the middle of the campaign. Instead of replacing damaged tanks, they were redeployed to areas where enemy morale was already weakened. The mere appearance of a CBH-1 was enough to end combats that, on any other front, would have been prolonged and bloody. A weapon made to destroy bunkers now began to operate as an instrument of collective surrender. At this point, you need to take a break. While the Germans were investing billions in prototypes like the Maus, a 188-ton supertank that never saw combat, the Americans were using makeshift variations of the Sherman to redefine the battlefield. The production of the Maus required almost 200,000 man-hours per unit. The CBH-1 was assembled in less than 20 days, with reused parts and field maintenance teams. In terms of actual impact, The world's heaviest tank has never fired. The fire tank has conquered an entire island. If this contrast seems absurd, that's because it is. Comment below. Shocking data, because it wasn't size that won the war. It was adaptability. As the North's defensive line crumbled, Japanese strategists themselves came to recognize that resistance was unsustainable. Kuribayashi's latest orders reveal a resigned tone. They no longer ask for advancement, only moral resistance. But morals had evaporated, like oxygen in a burning cave. The survivors began burning documents, burying flags and trying to flee to the interior of the island, where they believed the tanks would not follow them. They were wrong. The American units began to develop transport techniques on uneven terrain, dismantling trails, building wooden platforms, and using tractors to pull the CBH-1 to regions previously considered inaccessible. In less than a week, flamethrower tanks were operating in low-density forests and brittle lava fields, terrain that even the engineers themselves had not anticipated reaching. War became absolute. The battle map, previously divided into zones of resistance and zones of advancement, is now dominated by collapse points. Where there was a tank, there was surrender. Where he was expected, the enemy fled. Where it was lacking, the fighting was protracted. The very sound of its ignition came to have tactical value. Traders report that activating the compression system at long range caused panic in neighboring positions. It was as if the flame was not even lit yet, but its shadow was already consuming the field. The weapon had transcended technique. He had become a symbol, and like any symbol at war, it won for what it represented. The most telling statistic of this phase of the campaign is almost symbolic. Of the more than 1,000 bunkers built on Iwo Jima, more than 300 were abandoned without resistance after the introduction of flamethrower tanks. It's a number that German planners wouldn't even consider plausible. After all, in their simulations, no American weapon caused mass surrender. In his reports, Japanese discipline was absolute. They made a mistake, and they were wrong, because they ignored the psychology of fear. Fire doesn't just burn, he anticipates pain, and no military training can resist the anticipation of inevitable pain. In the next part, we will look at the most unexpected side effect of this terror, not in the countryside, but in the ideological trenches of Imperial Japan. Because as the tanks advanced through the caves, a doubt began to spread among Japanese officers. What if the enemy has even worse weapons? What if the fire is just the beginning? The canyon north of Iwo Jima had no official name. Among the soldiers he was christened Bloody Gorge. It was the last Japanese stronghold, where the survivors of the resistance had concentrated after weeks of successive retreats. A natural labyrinth of volcanic rock, with vertical slopes and tunnels dug on multiple levels, reinforced by machine gun emplacements, artillery nests, and ambush chambers. It was there that General Kuribayashi had decided to die, and it was there that the Americans gathered the largest concentration of flamethrower tanks of the entire Pacific War. The plan was simple and brutal: not to allow an exit, do not allow survival, to enclose the island with fire, and with it, the doctrine of imperial resistance. At dawn on the 33rd of the battle, 12 CBH-1 tanks began the siege of the canyon. Each operated with the support of a combined battalion, engineers, infantry, radio operators, and supply convoys. There was only one entry path, narrow, flanked by hillsides where the Japanese waited in ambush. In the first few minutes, 2 tanks were hit by manual explosives. One of them burned inside, killing all 3 crew members. The flames were not American this time, they were improvised, but the reaction came double. The remaining tanks took up staggered positions, alternating bursts of napalm with heavy machine gun cover. The throat became an oven. Oxygen has become scarce. The vegetation dissolved, and with it, discipline. Field reports indicate that at least 300 Japanese soldiers were entrenched in the area. A prolonged hand-to-hand combat was expected, as in the last hours of Suribachi, but it was different. The first advance of the fire forced a precipitous evacuation. The soldiers began to flee the caves before the tanks approached. They ran out, unarmed, covered in soot, trying to climb the sides. Half were shot down by infantry. The other half tried to retreat into the gorge, but found more tanks already in place, ready for flame crossing. The geometry of the attack was new. Fire from top to bottom, fire from bottom to top, crossfire on both axes. An engineered, controlled heat chamber. American logistics shone quietly. As the battle lines advanced, the supply lines operated like clockwork. In less than 12 hours, more than 50,000 liters of special fuel were transported to the front line, under artillery, under enemy fire, under the constant risk of explosion. Each tank operated at the limit. 80 seconds of fire, 10 minutes of reloading, 20 minutes of cooling. It was a mechanical choreography. While one fired, another retreated, another took position, another waited. No tower was inactive, no flame was wasted, and no shelter, no matter how deep, remained untouched. The American losses were real, but contained. 4 tanks damaged, 2 destroyed, 22 soldiers killed, but the cost of the enemy was absolute. By the end of the second day, the gorge had been neutralized. There were no communications left, no attack, no shots, just silence. Intelligence estimated that 90% of the Japanese force occupying the throat was eliminated by thermal suffocation or burns. The rest committed suicide or surrendered. One prisoner, interrogated hours later, muttered, "The throat was alive. She breathed fire." For many, it was the last image of the war, because there, at the bottom of that abyss of rock and blood, an entire doctrine had been buried. It was the brutal climax of a campaign that began with underestimation. General Kuribayashi, killed in ceremonial uniform in one of the tunnels, was found with a sheathed sword and his hands burned. He had tried to resist until the end, but the end came like lava, and not with a duel. This was the new war, a war where ancestral pride was irrelevant in front of a tank, adapted with napalm. A war won not by sheer force, but by the combination of intelligence, industry, and logistical precision. Japan had placed its men in the bowels of the earth. America responded with fire coming down from the surface. The gorge fell on March 25, 1945. With it, Iwo Jima was officially considered safe. What remained were pockets of resistance, lost soldiers, messages not received, but the battlefield had been sealed. And the world, on the other side of the ocean, was beginning to understand that something profound had changed. The war in the Pacific would not end with bayonets. It would end with symbols. And the next symbol was already being prepared in distant silos, where the fire of Iwo Jima seemed only an introduction, because the Japanese didn't know. But the next tank wouldn't have flames, it would have uranium. When the CBH-1 engines were shut down and silence finally fell over Iwo Jima, the American victory was uncontested, but something had been set on fire from within, and it wasn't the enemy. Among the teams of the flamethrower tanks, what began as a tactical mission ended up as a psychological burden. The same men who had held the line under fire, who had overwhelmed fortified bunkers and reduced underground fortresses to ashes, now faced an enemy they were not trained for: remembrance. When they returned to the camps, many avoided talking about what they had done. Reports from medical commanders record sleep disturbances, episodes of tremors, panic attacks when hearing sounds similar to the ignition of tanks. One operator wrote months later, "The fire extinguished the threat, but it ignited something inside us, something we can't erase." The war was over for the Corps, but not for consciousness. In post-battle interviews, Marines operating alongside the tanks revealed the discomfort of seeing the enemy not only fall, but be consumed. Napalm, unlike bullets, did not kill instantly. It produced screams, disordered movements, human shadows trying to escape the impossible. A naval officer declared in 1947, on condition of anonymity, "I never thought hell had sound until you hear what comes from inside a burning cave." Flamethrower operators, though decorated, rarely spoke. In his medical records, a term was often noted that was repeated: withdrawn conduct. For many, silence was the only way to continue. Official records confirmed this. After the Iwo Jima campaign, more than 40% of the flamethrower tank crew requested transfer to logistical or medical roles, not out of fear, but out of moral exhaustion. One of them, interviewed in 1952, said, "Killing from a distance is one thing, but when you listen, when you smell, when the enemy is screaming his last second, you don't come back the same." The efficiency of the weapon was undeniable, but this efficiency had an internal cost. What had been forged as a response to the silence of the tunnels now produced another silence within the soldiers themselves. In statistical terms, flamethrower tanks accounted for less than 1% of the vehicles employed in the Pacific, but on Iwo Jima, they accounted for about 30% of Japanese casualties. This disproportion reveals not only the technical power, but the psychological impact. Fire didn't just destroy structures, it collapsed wills. And among the operators, this absolute power became, paradoxically, a burden. Some began to refer to the vehicle itself not as a tank, but as the thing. It was a distancing, an attempt to separate the machine from the operator, as if the act of activating the valve was not his, but the machine's. During the post-war trials at Nuremberg and Tokyo, much was said about the limits of acceptable destruction, but flamethrower tanks were never questioned. They were cool, they were effective, they were tactically correct, and even so, they caused a nuisance that escaped the legal categories. In propaganda films, the CBH-1s appeared as symbols of victory. On the operators' cards, they were described with terms such as monster, demon, mechanical animal. It was as if each shot erased the line between man and machine and left the operator in doubt about what exactly had been burned that day, the enemy or humanity itself. Upon returning home, the crew of the CBH-1s did not find the same kind of reception reserved for pilots or snipers. There was no romanticism. There were no stories of heroism told around the fireplace. Many did not even reveal their functions to their families. A soldier of the 4th Battalion wrote in 1946, "My son will never know what I have done. He can call me a hero, but I remember the eyes of those I burned." This dissonance between public victory and internal torment defines the real price of war innovation. The war was won, but peace has been postponed for decades within each operator. The U.S. Navy, in reviewing its reports in 1946, informally acknowledged that flamethrower tanks produced results beyond what was expected, but left unforeseen scars. No medal was designed for those who endured the smell of their own shot. No monument was erected for those who won with heat. The triumph was strategic, but the defeat was emotional, and it spread silently through the halls of military hospitals, where former operators sought treatment for unnamed symptoms. This is the contradiction that modern warfare imposes. Technology allows victories with less visible human cost, but with a hidden, deep cost that settles in the souls of those who operate these machines. American doctrine had won with fire, with precision, with adaptation, but human doctrine, made up of empathy and internal limits, wavered, because there is no doctrine for the nightmare. There is no training to hear a scream that only you caused, and no statistics comfort the silence of those who have returned. In the next part, we will see how this same fire which conquered an island ignited an internal debate in the American command, whether a weapon that causes mass surrender and trauma to the operators themselves should be expanded to other fronts, or if Iwo Jima was the last camp where hell was allowed to drive a tank. By the end of the Iwo Jima campaign, as the numbers began to emerge from the field reports, a new narrative began to form, no longer one of individual bravery or tactical maneuvers, but of pure statistics. The battlefield had been turned into a moral spreadsheet, where every action was quantifiable, every explosion was measurable, and every life lost or spared was part of an equation. What the strategists discovered was as impactful as the battle itself. Just 8 CBH-1 flamethrower tanks alone had destroyed more than 1,000 Japanese fortifications, an average of 125 enemy positions neutralized per vehicle, a number that would seem absurd in any pre-war simulation. But there, over ashes and bodies, it was just reality. These 8 vehicles used approximately 360,000 gallons of specialty fuel, a mixture of diesel, gasoline, and stabilized napalm, a substance that, when expelled under 300 psi of pressure and ignited by electric ignition, not only incinerated the target, it collapsed structures, sucked oxygen from the environment, melted weapons, and silenced firing positions before they could even react. The data confirmed that about 30% of enemy kills on Iwo Jima were directly caused by flamethrower tanks, and the most astonishing, this percentage had been reached by less than 0.05% of the military assets mobilized for the campaign. But the most disconcerting part of the report came from American accounting. Logistical simulations and after-action reports estimated that without the introduction of flamethrower tanks, the number of American casualties would have been at least 5,000 troops higher. The difference between entering a bunker and burning it from a distance. The difference between digging a cave under machine gun fire and collapsing it with heat. The difference between weeks of combat for positions and immediate surrender in the face of terror. In the cold math of the General Staff, the CBH-1 had paid for themselves in less than 48 hours of operation. Every gallon burned was a life saved. Each 80-second shot saved hours of bloody advance. This was the new language of war. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them from the beginning. The flame, an archaic symbol of purification and destruction, became finally the maximum expression of industrial rationality. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts and understanding how modern warfare was decided less by fury and more by spreadsheets, enjoy this video and subscribe. This helps us continue to reveal the technical and human backstage behind the events that changed history, but the numbers did not stop at the gallons. Fuel had to be transported in extreme conditions, by convoys crossing beaches under bombardment, moved by adapted trucks, stored in reinforced containers, cooled under tent, and handled with insulating gloves. To keep 8 tanks in continuous operation, more than 200 men were directly involved. Operators, engineers, supply technicians, escorts, support infantry. The victory, therefore, was not only for the machine, it was for the system. A system that integrated engineering, supply, doctrine, adaptation, and responsiveness. A system that no other army in the world at that time could replicate. Across the ocean, in reinforced bunkers in Germany, the reports coming in about Iwo Jima provoked unease. The Nazi high command viewed with growing concern what they called American pragmatic engineering. While the Germans invested in miracle weapons and revolutionary concepts, such as V-2 rockets and Maus super-heavy tanks, the United States was winning wars with simple, adaptable, and efficient solutions. A German general, in a letter intercepted by British intelligence, wrote, "They have not our sophistication, but they have something more dangerous, endless production and ruthless logic," a phrase that today sums up the whole difference between ideology and logistics. In the next part, we'll get out of the spreadsheets and return to the battlefield, but this time through the eyes of those who saw the fire and decided to stop fighting. Because flamethrower tanks didn't just destroy fortresses, they destroyed convictions. And as the Japanese doctrine of death began to give way to quiet surrender, a new weapon emerged, invisible but devastating: moral collapse. When the echoes of Iwo Jima still resounded in the corridors of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff, one certainty was already established among military planners. What had occurred on that island was not just an operational victory, it was the foundation of a new doctrine. Modern warfare had undergone a silent mutation, wrought not in academies or research centers, but in the black sands covered with bodies and studded with fiery craters. The flamethrower tanks, initially improvised as an emergency response, had become the catalyst for a profound transformation in the way the United States would plan for conflict from then on. For the first time, the war had been won by a system, not by a force. The logic of integration, tanks, infantry, engineering, and logistics in symbiosis, ceased to be theory and became official doctrine. The first after-action analyses done by the Marine Corps doctrine offices confirmed armored units could no longer operate as occasional support. They should be thought of from the beginning as an organic part of the advance. Combat engineers, hitherto relegated to secondary roles, came to have quasi-tactical status. It was the backhoe man who cleared the way for the tank, and the flamethrower operator who decided whether a hill would be conquered or not. This total interdependence between machines, soldiers, and improvisation was translated in reports as adaptive combined operation, a terminology that, until then, was almost non-existent in the American military vocabulary. The CBH-1s, built in record time and without manuals, now served as the basis for a new concept: modular combat weaponry. The idea was simple but revolutionary. The perfect weapon was not one manufactured to perfection, but one capable of being adapted to the specific theater where it would be employed. Iwo Jima had proved this with brutal clarity. The flame tanks were not manufactured by central factories, but assembled by maintenance battalions in Hawaii. Success came not from uniformity, but from ingenuity. Each unit brought small differences, local adjustments, improvised solutions that reflected the terrain, the weather, and the enemy. This flexibility would become formal doctrine in 1946. In the revised Marine Corps manuals, the doctrine of clearing fortifications began to incorporate techniques directly inspired by the fighting on Iwo Jima. Maneuvering schemes began to consider the use of flames as a primary step, rather than as a last resort. The relationship between logistics and combat power was also reassessed. Technical reports detailed the fuel consumption, the psychological impact, the need for protected refueling routes. War was now thought of in supply lines, in the rate of fire, in interdependence of functions. The battlefield dictated the theory, and the flamethrower tanks, born of urgency, dictated the future. In addition to the manuals, the tactical courses were restructured. At Quantico, officials began to study the diaries of CBH-1 operators. Improvisation was elevated to an institutional virtue. The phrase corkscrew and burn, coined informally by the operators on Iwo Jima, has become an official technique, taught, documented, and analyzed. For the first time, improvisation was no longer a weakness. He became a model. The doctrine that emerged from the Black Island was not static, but organic. It fed on reality, adapted to the unexpected and favored effective simplicity over inflexible planning. It was the antithesis of German rigidity, a profound irony for an army that had hitherto been considered less sophisticated. This doctrinal transformation did not go unnoticed by the enemy. In the months following the Iwo Jima campaign, American intelligence intercepted documents from the Japanese and German high command. One of them, signed by a Wehrmacht colonel, bore a bitter observation: "The Americans have no fixed doctrine, they learn in real time." That phrase, written with contempt, has become a strategic truth. American superiority was not just in mass production or air dominance. It was in the ability to observe, adapt, and transform experience into the norm with a speed that no other army could replicate. And this mobile doctrine, born under fire and stitched together by field engineers, would be the basis of modern 20th century warfare. The impact of Iwo Jima would echo beyond the Pacific. The lessons learned there would shape Okinawa's planning, and later directly influence the design of operations in Vietnam, Korea, and even urban conflicts in the 21st century. The integration between technology, improvisation, and doctrinal adaptation would become the tripod of American war. And the flame tanks, even if banned years later by international conventions, would leave an invisible but decisive legacy. Victory is not for those who have the best theory. It is for those who turn each mistake into a new standard. In the next part, we will see how, even after the battle won and the doctrine transformed, Japan would still need to confront what was left, the survivors themselves, because the fire had destroyed the fortresses, but also melted convictions. And now it was left to the empire to deal with what it had never anticipated: soldiers who refused to die. In the silent accounts of Japanese survivors, written in shaky handwriting in interrogation cells or left in diaries buried among the ashes of Iwo Jima, a new narrative emerges, one that was never told in the newspapers of the time, but which carries the unbearable weight of those who saw their own doctrine crumble under the heat of a new kind of hell. The underground fortifications, once celebrated as temples of resistance, became death traps. The fire did not respect firing angles, makeshift armor, or codes of honor. He entered where the human eye could not reach: vents, crevices, communication holes. And when he arrived, there was no time for heroism. It sucked in air, collapsed lungs, turned concrete into a furnace, and the soldier into shadow. In the tunnels, the screams lasted no more than seconds. The silence that followed them was even more terrifying. Soldiers who survived the first impact, many with internal burns, instant blindness, or disorientation from hypoxia, described surrender not as an act of cowardice, but as an escape from an end that dehumanized even sacrifice. An artillery officer wrote, "We expected to die with honor. We die without air." Another, interrogated weeks after the surrender, confessed, "We no longer fought against men. We fought against an invisible, merciless heat that met us where we were safe." These voices, drowned out by decades of censorship and national shame, reveal that the most effective American weapon was not the tank or the flamethrower. It was the collapse of predictability. Japan trained its soldiers to withstand pain, not outright surprise. Military doctrine did not foresee that the shelter would be precisely the target. The fortress has become a trap. Discipline became prison. In the post-war period, Japanese military analysts reviewed every inch of Iwo Jima. They studied the layout of the tunnels, the soot marks on the vents, the points of thermal collapse on the concrete walls. And in classified reports, now declassified, a devastating realization emerged. Defensive engineering had achieved structural perfection, but failed in the face of the enemy's tactical innovation. In one of the documents, an imperial engineer wrote, "We have created a fortress for the war of the past." They struggled with the concept of the future. The psychological impact was so profound that in post-war training, the Japanese army completely removed any mention of the use of tunnels as a primary defense. The lesson was absorbed not by glorification, but by trauma. Among the interrogations conducted by the Americans, one case caught the attention of intelligence officials. One sergeant, captured in the final stages of the battle, remained silent for days. When he finally spoke, he said only one sentence: "The fire is in and our doctrine is out." A confession as simple as it is devastating. What for the Americans was efficiency, for the Japanese was disorientation. What for American engineers was technical advancement, for imperial soldiers was treason of the land itself. The ground, once firm and protected, had become an oven. There was nowhere else to tread. Axis strategists watched Iwo Jima with bewilderment. In an analysis found in German archives dated April 1945, a Wehrmacht general asked, "If even the Japanese masters of resistance and sacrifice surrendered to American fire, what awaits us in the next phase of the war?" The irony was thick. While the Third Reich bet on revenge weapons and super-heavy tanks, the United States won with quick adaptation, logistical power, and data-driven field decisions. The German doctrine, as well as the Japanese, was stuck with the idea that morality and technique were enough. But Iwo Jima had shown that the war of the future required something more: intellectual elasticity, total industrialization, and a responsiveness that respected no traditions, only results. Most symbolic of all was the place where this occurred. Iwo Jima was not Berlin. It wasn't Tokyo. It was a tiny island, 21 kilometers, forgotten between volcanic waves and rough seas. But there, under the smoke and the screams muffled by ashes, a new war had been born. And Japan, an empire accustomed to reverence and permanence, had been won not by quantity, but by concept. In the next part, the script will delve into the final paradox of this story, how the most effective weapon of war would become, a few years later, a forbidden weapon, because the same world that conquered with flames would finally begin to fear fire itself. Decades after the last explosion, when the echoes of war had already retreated into the subsoil of memory, a new kind of silence began to inhabit Iwo Jima, a silence that did not come from death, but from reunion. Under the same grey, now smokeless sky, American and Japanese veterans returned to the island where they had tried to kill each other, and where many left pieces of their souls. Some came with canes, others in wheelchairs. They all carried invisible marks, which are not healed with time, only with truth. In the joint ceremonies there were no fiery speeches, no military fanfares. There were only looks, and in some cases, brief, dry hugs that ended decades of silence with a gesture more powerful than any official surrender. There was a common point in the accounts of these men. No one forgot the fire, the smell of fuel, the roar of flames, the sound of steel deforming under absurd temperatures. But time, like the island itself, has tried to transform what was terror into understanding. A former US Marine who operated flamethrower tanks left a note at the foot of a rock scarred by explosions. "We didn't ask to use this weapon. We only asked that you survive it." Nearby, a former Japanese officer laid flowers and bowed before a makeshift memorial. When asked how he felt, he replied, "I was trained to hate them, but when the fire came, I understood that we were all in the same hell." Iwo Jima, which had once been a symbol of fanatical resistance and logistical dominance, now became a field of reconciliation, a place where the numbers finally fell silent and the names had faces again. Monuments sprang up, both in memory of those who fell and those who survived, and who therefore carried the war with them forever. For many, the reunion with former enemies was also a reunion with humanity itself. The generation that built tanks and fortresses began to build bridges of respectful silence, because they knew that there are victories that leave deeper scars than defeats. And in this scenario of belated contemplation, a recurring theme imposed itself with increasing force: the fate of the flamethrower tanks. The weapon that had redefined warfare, broken doctrines, and spared American lives was now viewed differently, not as an ethical failure, but as a moral limit. In the following decades, international treaties began to condemn the use of incendiary weapons against occupied structures. The United Nations Convention on Conventional Weapons, signed in 1980, dedicated a specific protocol to the control of liquid-fired weapons. The world that won with flames was beginning to fear the power of its own heat. The paradox was evident. What saved lives on Iwo Jima was now seen as unbearable to the modern consciousness. The doctrine of fire that penetrates tunnels had fulfilled its tactical mission, but its moral heritage was ambiguous. Not because it had failed, but because it had worked too well. A retired general summed it up bluntly. The flamethrower tank was too effective to ignore. It's too human to be repeated. Around the Iwo Jima memorials, small museums keep pieces of the CBH-1 preserved. Tanks that once spewed hell, now exposed as cold relics. Children touch the metal carcasses without knowing what happened inside them. The guides, veteran volunteers, choose their words carefully. They talk about logistics, engineering, and tactics. But sometimes, at the end of the tour, they stop in front of the main tower and just say, "This one didn't fail, and that's why today we try not to use it anymore." Because in the end, memory does not serve revenge. It serves the conscience. War teaches, but it takes a heavy toll. It teaches that technical innovation can overcome centuries-old traditions. It teaches that an island of 21 kilometers can change global military doctrines. But it also teaches that no weapon, no matter how advanced, replaces the need to remember, to understand, of, when possible, forgiving. And as we look at Iwo Jima today, silent, preserved, scarred by fire and reconciliation, there remains only one question. What will the future do with what the past has taught? In the next and final part, we will look at how this learning crystallized not just in treaties and monuments, but in a strategic legacy that shaped every war that followed, a legacy forged in the heat but tempered by memory. Iwo Jima was not just a tactical victory. It was the symbolic end of one era and the birth of another. There, under the unbearable heat of a volcanic archipelago, the doctrine of sacrifice found the limit of industrial logic. The Japanese fortress, carved by years of discipline and rock, was destroyed not by brute force, but by the technical insistence of a nation that had learned to turn workshops into weapons. Japan, like Germany, believed that courage could overcome volume, that trenches, caves, and codes of honor were enough against machines. They were wrong. Flamethrower tanks didn't just win positions, they incinerated a mindset, and in doing so, they ended centuries of morale-based combat and began the era of the system. Modern warfare would no longer be decided by swords or rifles, but by pipes, fittings, jerry cans, fuels, and improvised engineering. The lesson is universal. When war changes, those who do not change with it are condemned to burn with their certainties. On Iwo Jima, logistics didn't just win over tradition, it reduced it to ashes, and the enemies themselves recognized this. In a private report to the Japanese General Staff discovered years later, one officer wrote bitterly and accurately, "We were not defeated by soldiers. We were overcome by flames guided by engineers." If you value this type of research, where each piece of data is cross-referenced with real documents and testimonies, support the channel with your like and subscription. This allows us to continue excavating history as it really was. No adornments, no propaganda, just military, technical, and human truth. Activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. And tell us in the comments, what was the most shocking fact of this story for you? The fuel, the tunnels, the very idea of mass surrender caused by a gun? Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen, because if Iwo Jima has taught us anything, it is that war does not wait for tradition. It rewards those who imagine the unthinkable. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.